The autumn that came to Ardenmere did not arrive gently. It came in a single night, stripping the copper beaches bare, and laying a cold, pewter light over the Scottish borders that would not lift until April. The estate itself seemed to welcome the severity. Its stone walls, the colour of old pewter, had stood for 3 centuries against worse. It did not flinch at October, nor did the woman who scrubbed its front steps each morning before the household woke. Her name was Sable Wren, or rather, it was the name she answered to, a small, practical name, the kind given to a woman whose purpose was to be useful and unobtrusive. The other staff called her Wren. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dovecote, called her girl when she was in good temper, and you when she was not. The Earl of Ardenmere, Lord Callumstrath, had never called her anything at all. She was simply part of the furniture of his house, as much a fixture as the brass candlestick she polished or the flagstones she swept. She had learned not to mind this, or she had learned to behave as though she did not mind it, which, after enough years, amounts to nearly the same thing. What she did mind, in the private country of her own heart, were the mornings before the house stirred, before the great oak doors swallowed her back into her station, were briefly hers. She would stand at the top of the steps, the brush still in her hand, and look out over the formal hand to the wild moorland that stretched south toward the hills. In those minutes she was nobody's servant. She was simply a woman standing on cold stone, breathing cold air, watching the light change on a landscape that had known her family's name long before it had known the Earl's. The Wrens had been Wrens for as long as anyone at Ardenmere could remember. The name itself had once meant something, a small, quick, observant bird. Industrious, overlooked, singing in the dead of winter when every other creature fell silent. It was a good name for what she had become, even if it was not the name she had been born to. She had been born Sable Corndale, but that name had been buried 15 years ago, along with her father's reputation, and everything that had once made her life recognizable as her own. The Earl of Ardenmere kept horses. This was not unusual for a man of his position, but the particular horse that concerned Sable was unusual in every other respect. His name was Thorn, and he was a Scottish Warmblood of extraordinary quality, a deep bay with a black mane that he wore like a king's crown. He had been brought north from a breeder in Northumberland 2 years prior, and in those 2 years he had made himself legendary in the county for one reason alone. He would not be ridden. This was not the theatrical refusal of a young green horse, all plunging and noise. Thorn was quieter and more absolute than that. He simply declined. A groom would approach, reach for the halter, and the horse would turn his back. A rider would mount, briefly, before finding himself on the ground in a way he could not quite account for. Not thrown, not bucked, simply deposited. As if the horse had determined with cold precision that this particular arrangement was not to his liking and had made the necessary adjustment. 2 experienced grooms had walked away from Thorn's paddock with their pride stripped and their confidence shaken. One had broken a collarbone. No one went near him now unless they had to. He stood in the far corner of the paddock, nearest the kitchen garden, glossy and magnificent and entirely self-contained, watching the world from a distance that he had chosen, and that no one had been able to breach. Sable passed his paddock every morning, on her way to the woodpile. She had not set out to do anything about him. She was not in the habit of making decisions about the Earl's livestock. And she was not, by any stretch of the word, a horsewoman. Not any more. That had been a different life, belonging to a different girl, the girl who had ridden out at dawn on the Corndale estate with her father beside her, who had learned the language of horses before she had learned to read, who had known, with the absolute certainty of a child, that she was beloved. She did not think of that girl often, but on a Tuesday morning, in the 2nd week of October, She was fetching an armful of logs, and she stopped, as she sometimes stopped, at the paddock rail. Thorn was at the far end, motionless in the grey light. The frost had silvered the grass. His breath made soft clouds in the cold air. She did not know why she hummed. It was not a decision. It was something older than decision, a song her father had taught her, a low, wandering melody that had no words, the kind of tune you hum to a creature you are not trying to impress. She hummed it into the cold morning air the way one hums when entirely alone, without self-consciousness, without intention. Thorn's head lifted. He turned, not sharply, not with the nervous electricity of a startled animal, but with a slow, considering attention, the way a person turns when they have heard something that interests them. His dark eyes found her at the rail. He stood very still. She stood very still. The melody continued, fragile and unhurried, hanging in the frost. He took one step toward her, then another. He crossed the paddock in a slow, deliberate walk that bore no resemblance to the flat-eared wariness he showed to everyone else. When he reached the rail, he stopped. They were 2 feet apart. He dropped his great head and exhaled a long breath that fogged between them. She did not move. She did not know that Lord Callum Strath had come out of the side door of the stables, not 30 feet away, and had stopped walking the moment he saw them. He had come to speak with his head groom about feed orders. He was a man of routine, of purpose. He did not linger. But he lingered now, standing in the shadow of the stable wall, with his arms loose at his sides, watching the impossible scene unfold with the expression of a man whose certainties have just been quietly upended. Thorn pressed his nose to the paddock rail. Sable, without thinking, without asking herself whether this was wise or proper, or, within the scope of her employment, reached up and touched the flat of her palm to the horse's nose. His skin was warm, the hair fine and short, and the warmth of him moved up through her cold fingers with the force of something she had buried 15 years ago and had forgotten she missed. She was not aware that she was crying until she tasted salt. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist before she turned, and she turned only because she had to get back to the house before the kitchen fire needed stoking. She did not see the Earl. She did not see anything at all except the path in front of her, and she made her way back to the servants' entrance, with her armful of logs and her composure reconstructed by the time she reached the kitchen door. The order came before supper. It was delivered by the head groom, a compact Aberdeenshire man named Finlay, who looked at her with an expression that managed to convey both bewilderment and skepticism simultaneously. The Earl, he said, wished the woman Wren to report to the stables the following morning. She was to be temporarily reassigned from household duties to assist with Thorn. The news moved through the servants' hall the way all news moves through a closed household, rapidly and with embellishment. Sable received it standing at the sink, her hands still wet. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the darkened window above the basin. Fear, she noted, arrived before anything else. The stables meant the yard. The yard meant being seen. She had spent the better part of 2 years becoming architecturally invisible within this house, fitting herself into its corners, learning its rhythms, moving through its days without leaving a mark. The stables meant proximity to Lord Strath himself, and Lord Strath was a man who, when he looked at something, saw it clearly. She dried her hands. There was nothing for it. The morning was bitter. Finlay met her in the yard with the undisguised skepticism of a man who considers the entire arrangement an insult to professional horsemanship. He was not unkind about it. He was simply direct. She was to muck out the small paddock, clean the water troughs, and under no circumstances was she to attempt to handle the horse. If Thorn came to the rail, she was to move away calmly and find him immediately. She nodded. She understood perfectly. She took the rake and set to work. Thorn watched her from his corner of the paddock. Throughout the morning, his gaze, a steady, considering weight. She kept her head down and her movements quiet, the way one moves in a church, not from fear, but from a kind of instinctive respect. She worked methodically. She did not look at him directly, but she hummed. By the third morning, he had begun to follow her along the inside of the fence. It was Finlay who brought Lord Strath to see it. They stood together at the gate, the head groom with his jaw set in the expression of a man reconciling himself to something he does not understand, and the Earl with no expression at all, which, in a man of his particular stillness, was its own kind of intensity. The Earl of Ardenmere was not old. He was, Sable supposed, somewhere in his middle 30s, though he carried the particular gravity of a man who had been responsible for too much, too young. He had a lean, angular face, dark hair touched at the temples with the first quiet signals of grey, and eyes the colour of the loch in winter, not quite blue, not quite green, the colour of cold-moving water. He had inherited the title at 24 when his father had died of a fever, and with it a debt-laden estate and a reputation only recently and incompletely repaired. He did not look like a man who let things go unexplained. That same afternoon she was called to the steward's office. She had expected Mrs. Dovecote. She found the Earl. He was standing at the window, his back to the room. Looking out at the paddock, he turned when she entered. His gaze assessed her with the same quiet efficiency with which she had seen him assess a disputed estate ledger. "You're the woman from the kitchens," he said. "Yes, my lord. Finlay tells me. Thorn follows you. He follows the fence line." I happened to be on the other side of it. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement, quite. An adjustment. "You have a facility with horses," he said. It was not a question. "I knew horses once," she said. The words came out before she had decided to say them. She pressed her mouth closed on whatever else might follow. He looked at her for a long moment. "Once," he repeated. "A long time ago, my lord." He did not press her. He was the kind of man who understood the difference between information offered and information withheld, and respected the distinction even when it frustrated him. He told her she would continue with Thorn for the foreseeable future. Finlay would oversee her work. She was to report anything unusual. She curtsied and left. She did not know that he stood at the window until she had crossed the full width of the yard, and that he watched her the way a man watches something he cannot account for, and intends, quietly, to think about. Lady Anstice arrived a fortnight later. She was the Earl's cousin by marriage, a handsome woman in her mid-30s, who moved through Ardenmere with the easy authority of someone who has calculated their welcome, and found it sufficient. She had brought with her 2 trunks, a personal maid, and an agenda that she wore as lightly as her travelling coat, but which was, on close inspection, rather heavier. Lady Anstice had decided some time ago that her own daughter Fay ought to marry the Earl. The logic was straightforward. Fay was accomplished, presentable, and agreeable. The Earl was titled and solvent again. The arrangement made obvious sense to everyone who stood to benefit from it. That Lord Strath had not yet arrived at this conclusion himself was, in Lady Anstice's view, a temporary oversight she had come to Ardenmere to correct. Sable knew Lady Anstice by reputation before she knew her by sight. In a household where she had learned to read the weather of a room before she entered it, the arrival of a woman like Lady Anstice was the equivalent of a pressure drop before a storm. She made herself more invisible than usual. She was not entirely successful. It was in the corridor outside the linen room, 11 days after Lady Anstice's arrival, that she was stopped. "You're the stable girl," Lady Anstice said. She was looking at Sable with the particular attention of a woman who has noticed something inconvenient and is deciding what to do about it. "I assist with 1 horse, my lady. My cousin finds you interesting." The statement was delivered without inflection, which made it more effective than any accusation. "I find that curious. I would not presume to account for his lordship's observations." Lady Anstice studied her. Her eyes were sharp and pale, and missed nothing. "Where are you from?" "The borders, my lady. Your family." "My father was a farmer on the Strath estate," Sable said. The lie came out cleanly, the way all well-practiced lies do. Without tremor, Lady Anstice looked at her for one beat longer than was comfortable. Then she smiled, a smile that was entirely surface. "How practical," she said, and moved on. Sable stood in the empty corridor and did not let herself breathe until the sound of footsteps had faded. She was not afraid of Lady Anstice. She had survived worse than a calculating woman in a good coat. What frightened her, in the privacy of her own chest, was the conversation she could not account for, the precise assessment in Lady Anstice's eyes that had not looked at her the way one looks at a servant, but the way one looks at a problem. 3 nights later, Lord Strath's study was broken into. It was not a violent breach. The window latch had been lifted from outside, an old trick, the kind that required knowledge of the house's architecture and the patience to wait for the right hour. The study was well ordered and little was disturbed, but one item was missing from the locked correspondence drawer, a sealed letter bearing the Corndale crest. The Earl discovered this himself in the morning. He said nothing to the household at large. He was not a man who showed his hand before he understood the game, but he understood more than anyone knew. He had been thinking about the woman called Wren for 3 weeks, and not merely because of Thorn. It was the song. The low, formless melody she hummed had caught at something in his memory, like a loose thread, nagging, unspecific, until one evening he had gone to the library and pulled down the bound volume of his grandfather's diaries and read, in faded ink, a passage dated 31 years prior, "Rode out with Corndale today to look at his new colt. A finer piece of horsemanship I have not seen in a man. His daughter, little Sable, rode with us, 8 years old and more at ease in the saddle than most of my grooms. She sang to the horse when it was nervous, that same queer tune her father whistles when he works. There is something in the Corndale blood. They have always understood animals in a way I cannot explain." He had read the passage twice. Then he had gone to his father's locked cabinet, the Corndale estate. He knew the name, knew the history the way one knows as a dark chapter of a familiar book, not examined closely but not forgotten. Sir Aldrich Corndale had been accused of falsifying land deeds. 20 years ago his lands had been seized, his reputation destroyed. The accusation had been orchestrated, most people suspected, by Lord Fenwick of the neighbouring Havergate estate, who had subsequently acquired the forfeited Corndale land at a ruinous discount. But suspicion was not proof, and Lord Fenwick was well connected, and Sir Aldrich had died in disgrace before the truth had found its voice. He had a daughter, who had been taken in, Lord Strath's father had noted, by the Anstice relations. Lord Strath sat in his study for a long time after reading this. The fire burned down to ash before he moved. He found what he was looking for in his father's correspondence chest, a letter, unsealed, dated 18 years prior, addressed to Sir Aldrich Corndale, and never sent his handwriting, familiar and pained. "My dear Aldrich, I have done what I could. I have made arrangements with Halsford for Ardenmere to serve as custodian of the Corndale northern acreage until the falsification claims can be properly contested. It is yours in every way that matters. I have told no one. The Anstice cousins have agreed to take your Sable. I will watch over her interests as my own. When she comes of age, if the political situation permits, we will restore what was taken. I swear it on my name." He was a man of logic, of documents, of things that could be substantiated. He had no patience for sentiment masquerading as evidence, and yet he sat with that letter for a very long time. The next morning he found her in the paddock, working. He said nothing for a while. He stood at the fence and watched Thorn pacing at Sable's shoulder like a dog, the horse's enormous head dipping every few steps toward her as though to confirm she was still there. "Walk with me," he said. They took the long path toward the south field, above the morning mist. Thorn watched them go from the fence unmoving, waiting. "You lied to me," the Earl said. She stopped walking. The cold air was very still. "My lord, your father was not a farmer." He did not say it as an accusation. He said it the way one states a fact one has already made peace with. "He was Sir Aldrich Corndale, and you are Sable Corndale." The silence that opened up around that name was enormous. She looked at him. She had the particular stillness of a person who has spent years bracing for a blow and does not know, when the moment finally arrives, whether to flinch or stand straight. She stood straight. Her hands were at her sides. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes were clear and level. "How?" she said. "My father's letter, his journal, your horse." He paused. "Your song." Her jaw tightened. She looked away across the moor. The hills were bronze and grey in the October light, the sky overhead the colour of pewter. She had looked at this landscape every morning for 2 years and told herself it was not hers. It did not look any different now that she was standing in it as herself. "My father died in disgrace," she said. "His name was taken. His land was taken. I was taken." There was no bitterness in the words, just the flatness of facts, absorbed so long ago they had become simply the ground beneath her. "The Anstis cousins took me in. They were paid by your father to do so, I suspect, though I did not know it then. They told me my name was finished, that to survive I had to be small and quiet and grateful." She paused. "I learned to be. They lied to you. Everyone lied to me. That is not remarkable." "It is remarkable," he said, with a quiet force that surprised her. "It is a crime, dressed up as charity." He looked at her steadily. "My father made a promise that he did not keep, or that he left unfinished, which amounts to the same failure. He was not excusing it. She could hear that. She said nothing. After a moment he said, "The land he held in trust, it is here." It was folded into the Ardenmere accounts 20 years ago when it became too complicated to explain otherwise. The income from it has been recorded separately. I found it 3 weeks ago and did not fully understand what I was looking at. Now I do. She turned to look at him. "I intend to correct this," he said. The words were so simply delivered that they hit her harder than a pronouncement would have. There was no drama in them, just the quiet certainty of a man who has decided. "You cannot simply." "I can. The documentation exists, the contested deeds, Fenwick's correspondence with the land assessor, and the proof of its falsification. My father gathered it all and never acted. I don't know why." He looked away for a moment. "He died before he could, I think, and then the years went on, and no one knew where to look for you. I was in his house. There was nothing more to say about that." They stood together in the cold, the moor spreading wide around them, and Sable felt something she had not felt since she was a girl on horseback in the early morning of a country that had once been hers. The vertiginous, terrifying sensation of having nothing between herself and the open air. He began calling her Miss Corndale. The first time he said it, in front of the household, was in the entrance hall with Mrs. Dovecote and 2 footmen present. He said it without ceremony, in the middle of asking whether she had checked Thorn's near foreleg, where Finlay had noted a small swelling. Miss Corndale, had she looked at it, the name fell into the entrance hall like a stone into still water. Mrs. Dovecote's eyes widened. The footman exchanged a glance. Miss Corndale looked briefly arrested, colour rising in her face, then answered his question about the foreleg, with composure that cost her more than anyone watching could see. Lady Anstis heard about it within the hour. She found the missing letter that evening, Tucked into the lining of her travelling trunk, the letter that bore the Corndale crest and contained, in Sir Aldrich's own hand, his detailed account of Lord Fenwick's scheme, the names of the witnesses he had obtained, and the notation that a copy had been placed in trust at a solicitor's office in Edinburgh. It had been taken from Lord Strath's study, read and returned, too late to be useful to her, but early enough for her to understand that the ground had shifted entirely beneath her feet. She requested a private dinner with the Earl that evening. Lord Strath agreed. He sent a separate invitation to Sable, not a summons, not an order, a written invitation in his own hand, requesting the pleasure of her company at dinner that evening. Sable read it 3 times in her attic room. The Duchess had come. No, there was no Duchess here. There was only Mrs. Dovecote, who appeared at her door 20 minutes later with a dress box under one arm and an expression of determined composure over a great deal of feeling. "It's not my place," the housekeeper said, setting the box down on the narrow bed, "to say much of anything, but I have been in this house for 29 years, and I knew your father, Miss Corndale. I knew who he was." She did not look at Sable when she said it. She kept her eyes on the box, straightening a corner that did not need straightening. He was a man worth knowing. She left without opening the box. Inside was a dress of dark blue wool, simply cut, fine, without being showy. There was no note. Sable held it for a moment, and then, with the particular deliberateness of a woman taking a last step, she put it on. When she came down the back staircase and through the connecting passage to the small dining room, the footman who held the door for her paused, visibly, before remembering himself. Lord Strath was at the fireplace. He turned when she entered. Whatever he had been expecting, some recalibration occurred in his expression, small and swiftly controlled, but visible. Lady Anstice was seated already, her dress a deep crimson that now seemed, in the understated warmth of the room, to be trying too hard. "Why is she here?" Lady Anstice said, her voice stripped of its habitual courtesy. "Miss Corndale is my guest," Lord Strath said. He pulled out a chair for Sable, an act of deliberate, visible courtesy that Lady Anstice clearly understood, because she set down her wine-glass with a small, controlled precision. The dinner was its own kind of theatre. The food was served and eaten with an elaborate surface civility under which several things were happening simultaneously. Lady Anstice worked to recover ground she had not expected to lose. Lord Strath was patient and immovable. Sable said little and observed everything. She had spent 20 years learning to read the room. When the soup was cleared, Lord Strath set a leather folder on the table. "I have been reviewing my father's correspondence," he said. His voice was easy, almost conversational. He kept detailed records of his dealings with the surrounding estates, including a great deal of correspondence regarding the land assessment disputes of 2 decades ago. He looked at Lady Anstice. "Your family managed Miss Corndale's guardianship for 15 years. I am curious, Lady Anstice, what became of the assets her father had placed in trust." The colour in Lady Anstice's face shifted. "There were no assets," she said. "The estate was ruined. The guardianship was an act of charity. It was an act of obligation," Lord Strath said, "undertaken in exchange for a payment from my father's estate, documented here." He slid a paper across the table. Payment which continued for some years, and which the Anstice household received in full, while Miss Corndale was given the status of a servant. He paused. In her own family's house, as it happens, since the northern acreage her father held was subsequently folded into Ardenmere. A beat. "My family, it seems, has kept the Corndale land warm while yours consumed the Corndale daughter." The silence was absolute. Lady Anstice did not weep. She was not a woman who wept in front of an audience. She sat very straight, her crimson dress now looking like armour from which the fastening had been removed. When she spoke, her voice was controlled but small. "My husband's family had debts. We had nothing. The arrangement was presented to us as an opportunity, Lord Strath said quietly. She closed her mouth. I am not interested in ruin, he said. I am interested in correction. He looked at her for a long, level moment. You will leave Ardenmere tomorrow morning. I will not speak publicly of the arrangement if you do not give me cause to. What you tell your daughter, and whether she has further dealings with this estate, will depend entirely on what you do next. Lady Anstice stood. She was very still. She looked at Sable once, a look in which something complicated flickered. Not regret, quite, but the shadow of what regret might one day become. And then she left the room. The quiet she left behind was a different quality of quiet than the one before she entered. Lord Strath did not speak immediately. He looked at the fire. Sable looked at the folder on the table, and at her own name written in faded ink on the document inside it. He slid it across to her. This is the deed of custodianship, he said. It is a legal document transferring management of the Corndale acreage from my estate's trust back to its rightful holder. He paused. I will not pretend my family's hands are clean in this. We held what should have been returned. The delay is ours to account for. She looked at the document. It was strange, seeing her name in official ink. Not the brief name, not Wren, but Sable Corndale in the clean, formal hand of a solicitor who had written it down as a fact. She reached out and picked up the pen he had placed beside it. The aftermath was quiet and practical. Lady Anstice departed before breakfast. Mrs. Dovecote reorganized the household arrangements with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had privately been waiting for something of this sort. Sable did not move into the main house that day, or the week after. She was not a woman who changed her life at speed. She never had been. She continued to rise early. She continued to walk to the paddock. She began to learn the estate accounts, sitting across from Lord Strath's land steward in the morning room, asking the kind of questions that told the steward immediately that this was a woman who had been listening carefully for a long time. She resumed her name, not ceremonially, not with announcement, but in the small, persistent way that names reassert themselves. She began to introduce herself as Miss Corndale to the tenant farmers, to the suppliers, to the parish minister when he called on a Thursday in November. She did it without flourish. She did it the way one plants something in cold ground. Not certain of the spring, but sure of the seed. Lord Strath did not impose himself on the process. He gave her space with a particular attentiveness of a man who understands that a person reclaiming their own life needs room to do it without an audience. He was present and practical and unfailingly respectful. He asked her opinion on drainage repairs for the East Field. He sent her the Edinburgh solicitor's address without comment. He deferred to her knowledge of the northern acreage land grades, which were, it turned out, considerable. They flew Thorn, not flew. Thorn was a horse, not a hawk. But they rode the high moorland together twice a week when the weather allowed, and those rides became the armature of something that could not be precisely named, only observed. On the moor, in the thin cold light above the borders, neither of them was their title or their history. They were simply two people who had learned early that the world was not arranged fairly, and who had each developed, in response to that knowledge, a very similar kind of careful, watchful stillness. When they recognized it in each other, they did not speak of it. They did not need to. His name, she had discovered, was Callum. He had never told her to call him that. She had found it in the household register, in the old notation of his christening. Callum James Strath, 14th Earl of Ardenmere. The first time she used it, they were at the crest of the South Hill in November wind, and it simply came out as natural and as serious as breath. He turned. Something moved across his face, open and unguarded, that she had not seen there before. Sable, he said. Just that, his voice low, acknowledging something larger than the name itself. They stood together in the wind. She told him one afternoon in December about her father. Not the public version, the falsification, the ruin. He knew that already, had read it in documents and ledgers, but the private version. The early mornings on horseback, the particular way he had laughed, the song he had taught her that had no name and no origin, and that she had carried inside her like contraband, through all the years of her diminishment. He listened, in the way he did everything, with full attention and no interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father made a promise he didn't keep. I don't know if I can make that right entirely. I don't know that it's mine to make right." He looked at her. "But I would like to try." She understood that he was not only talking about the land. Love, for people who have spent a long time protecting themselves, does not arrive as a storm. It arrives the way the light arrives in January. Slowly, and from an unexpected angle, and then all at once everywhere. It was there in the way he waited at the paddock gate on mornings she was late. It was there in the careful way he had not pressed her, when she kept her distance, respecting the architecture of her self-possession. It was there in the way she had begun, without deciding to account for him in her thoughts of the future. Not as a circumstance she was navigating around, but as a presence she was, gradually and with great seriousness, moving toward. He asked her, on a grey afternoon in February, to walk with him to the south field. The borders in February are inhospitable and magnificent. The heather was dull brown, the grass silvered, the sky a pale, enormous sheet above them. Thorn had followed them to the paddock gate and stood watching, his breath clouding, his dark eyes patient and inscrutable. "I want to say something to you," the Earl said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I think you have had enough of oblique intentions." She was still. The wind lifted her hair. "I am not offering you restoration," he said. "The land is yours, regardless. That is not this." He paused, choosing words with the precision of a man to whom words matter. "I am asking whether you would consider building something with me, not because of obligation, not because of what my family owes yours, but because I find in your company a quality of attention that I have not found elsewhere, and I believe, I hope, that you have found something of the same in mine." He was not a man given to speech-making. These were, she understood, the most unguarded words he had spoken in a very long time. "I am asking," he said more quietly, "if you will marry me, Sable, as my equal, as my partner, as the person I choose." The wind moved between them. She looked at him for a long time, not with hesitation. She knew, had known for weeks, what the answer was, but with the care of a woman savoring the precise moment when something shifts from waiting to actual, from hoped for to real. "Yes," she said, "Callum, yes." He took her hand and held it, and that was enough. They married in the small church in the village below Ardenmere on a Tuesday in April, when the gorse was just beginning to come into its colour and the hills had softened from grey to green. Mrs. Dovecote stood in the front pew and wept without any attempt at concealment. Finlay stood at the back, with his arms crossed and his eyes suspiciously bright. The tenant farmers came in numbers that surprised nobody who had watched the new Miss Corndale, over the preceding months, learn their children's names and ask after their drainage problems and speak to them as people rather than difficulties to be managed. Thorn was brought to the churchyard. He stood quietly at the gate. In the April wind, his black mane lifted, his dark eyes patient as always, watching the doors. Years later, when the house at Ardenmere had grown warmer and louder, with the business of children and seasons and everything that accumulates in a life actively lived, Sable would stand sometimes at the window of the upstairs sitting room and look out over the paddock where Thorn's descendants moved in the evening light. She would think of the girl who had scrubbed those steps each morning before the house woke and stood at at the top, looking out, not quite daring to want what she wanted. She had not been saved. She had simply been seen, and that had made all the difference. She had been the one who crossed the paddock. She had been the one who held her hand steady. She had been the one who kept the song alive through all the years, when no one was listening. She had come, anyway, and Ardenmere, in the end, had known her name all along.